Welcome to Inspiring Heartfelt Conversations. My name is Barbara Morningstar. This series is presented by In Autumn's Cocoon, which offers education on a range of end-of-life topics in the form of workshops, writings, and talks. For more information, you can go to inautumnscocoon.com. Today, my guest is Betty Davies. Betty is currently adjunct professor, School of Nursing, University of Victoria in British Columbia, and Professor Emerita, Family Healthcare Nursing, UCSF. Throughout her long career as a clinician, teacher, administrator, and researcher, she has focused on death, dying, and bereavement, particularly from the perspective of children and families, nurses, and other healthcare providers in palliative care. Her research is reported in over 200 publications, including a new book, Pediatric Palliative Care, a Model of Exemplary Practice, which just came out this year. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you, Barbara.
It's a true honor to have you here. We're in the Vancouver area, and you're actually a historic part not only of the work, but within our country, because you're also the co-founder of Canuck Place, which was the first freestanding hospice for children in North America. So we're, really privileged to sit with you today and learn from your wisdom in this really tender area of life and transition.
Well, I'm honored that you asked me.
Okay. So children, my goodness, the topic of death is sensitive for anyone to step into in general. And then when you think of children and the vulnerability of these little ones, it pulls on the heartstrings even more. So on a personal note, I wanted to start by asking you, why children as opposed to working with adults? What drew you to pediatric palliative care?
Well, I guess I've always really been attracted to and curious about children. I just think children are so amazing. And I feel that the world doesn't know enough about and respect children enough and understand them. So I've always had a passion for children. And then from as far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a nurse. And so I wanted to be a nurse looking after children. But I also wanted to teach nursing. So I knew all of those things from a very early age. So that was my goal, and I just stuck with it. So then I went to nursing school. I was so happy to be there. And I learned a couple of very important things. One, nursing is focused on, so we were taught three things. One, to keep people healthy and prevent illness. Two, when they get ill, to care for them and treat them well so they can get better. And three, when they can't get well, to help them die with dignity. Well, it became quite clear that in our nursing school, as at that time, most nursing schools and medical schools, nothing was taught about that third part, about the dying part. So I often tell the story of my very first experience with death as a nursing student. And I was a second-year student, so I was like 18 years old. I'd never experienced a death of anyone close to me. And I was on a respiratory unit in the middle of the winter when lots of people were very ill on the unit. And we were short-staffed because many of the staff were also ill. So I came to work on a Saturday morning. There was the charge nurse, myself, and the nurse's aide. And the charge nurse took over all the administrative parts and some patients, but divided the other patients between me and the nurse's aide. So we had night report, or morning report, sometimes called. And during report, the night nurse said about Mrs. Jones, a woman of about, 70, who had cancer of the lung, and she was very ill. So during report, she told all the information about Mrs. Jones, and she said, but I was really surprised she made it through the night. And I remember sitting there just thinking, well, what if she doesn't make it through the day? And so I said this little prayer, dear God, please let her live through my shift.
No.
Because I didn't know what I'd do if she didn't.
No.
So the nurses aide went out to sort of make the rounds while I gathered all my information together. And she came back and she said, I think you better come and look at Mrs. Jones. So I went to look at Mrs. Jones. And as soon as I entered the room and saw her, I knew she had died during report. I had no idea what to do. But I remembered watching a TV show once where the nurse had drawn the curtain around the bed and laid the bed flat when a patient had died, in whatever TV story that was. So that's what I did. And then I went to the nurse's station, and the charge nurse was there on the phone taking medical orders from a physician. And I said to her in a shaky voice, my knees shaking, I said, I think Mrs. Jones has died. And she said, as she's talking on the phone, she doesn't even look at me. She points up to the bookshelf on the wall, and she says, the procedure book is up there, which meant get the procedure book, look up the procedure for caring for a body after death, and go do it. So I gathered up the book, the page of the book, the equipment we needed. Luckily, in the meantime, the nurse called nursing office to send someone to help. So the person they sent to help was another second-year student like myself, who had no more experience than I did. So we went through the process of preparing Mrs. Jones' body. And it involves, as you probably know, you bathe the body. So I wrapped the washcloth around my hand, like nurses know how to do, so the water's not dripping all over the patient in the bed. And I went to touch her, and I could not bring my hand to her skin. So I took a deep breath, pulled it back, wrung out the cloth again, tried a second time. And this time my hand was just shaking so much. I couldn't control it. Suffocating. I looked up at my friend across the bed. And especially when you're young, I think, there's this very fine line between crying and laughing when you're really stressed. So when my hand shook so much, we started to giggle. And then we realized that was inappropriate. So we tried to stop, So then we were concentrating on that. My other hand accidentally touched her leg. And I said, oh my gosh, she's still warm. So obviously I had expected, not knowing it, but just expecting that when someone dies, their body gets cold and stiff. Well, they do, but not that quickly. Excuse me. So we continued with the procedure, constantly giggling and crying, reading the pages to what to do. You're supposed to cross the arms and put a piece of cotton batting between the wrists to keep the arms from flopping away, but also not so tight that you damage the skin. Well, we put tied them so tight we couldn't get the cotton batting in, so that left another little bunch of giggles. Anyway, we finally finished. And then we remembered, oh my gosh, Mrs. Jones is in a 4-bed room. On the other side of this curtain are 3 other patients.
Wow.
Well, 2 of them were also very elderly and very confused, and they had no idea what was going on. But at the foot of Mrs. Jones' bed across from us was a woman who was very alert. So I peeked through the curtain to see, if she was still there or what was happening. Excuse me. And she was sitting with her legs crossed, her elbows on her knees and her chin on her hand, watching the curtain, the crack in the curtain. So when I opened it, she was right there and we had immediate eye contact. And she simply said in this very empathetic voice, first time, isn't it?
The wisdom of an elder right there.
She held open her arms and we went and sat on her bed and she just held us, That woman saved the day because I think my friend and I would have just quit at that point otherwise.
That's really quite beautiful. Actually.
Yeah, it really emphasized for me how important it is that nursing students and all healthcare students and all of us learn about death, particularly in nursing, because when people die, most often it's a nurse who's with them or is called to the bedside first. So nurses really need to understand what it is to be with a dying patient and to deal with death. So that taught me that lesson And especially since I knew I wanted to teach, I thought, okay, no student of mine is ever going to pass through my hands without learning something about death and dying. So from there, another rotation was in pediatrics. And I go to pediatrics, and there I learned about lots of things. One of the things I learned about, a serious topic, was child abuse. Because there was a little boy being cared for on the unit in the special room right next to the nursing station where he could be observed 24 hours a day. His name was Nathan, and I was assigned to him. And I looked after Nathan, who was unconscious. And the story was that his parents said, was that he had been on the farm and he'd gotten stuck in the outhouse. And so he tried to crawl out from under the door. And that's why he had so many scratches and bruises on him. And in the process, he hit his head, and that's why he was unconscious. Well, I had no concept of anything called child abuse. So I became very interested in that topic. But I couldn't study it. The abuse part was too hard for me to deal with. So I focused on how children die. And this is one way that children die. And so it expanded my knowledge about death. And then I cared for a little girl whose name was Susie. And Susie was about 4, and she had leukemia. And back in those days, 90% of children with ALL died from their disease. Today, over 90% of children recover from that. So it's gone from one side to the other. A wonderful, wonderful change. But little Susie was before that time. And with leukemia, children end up with little red spots and kind of bruises on their skin. And she had a little pet frog, a stuffed toy. She called him Froggy. So I'm giving her a morning bath. And she picks up Froggy and she says to me, you know, Froggy has spots. Mm-hmm. He has spots just like me. Froggy's not going to get better, you know. Well, that was a very moving moment because it taught me that children are aware of things in ways that we as adults lose track of or don't understand. So all of that together really reinforced my interest in death and dying, and especially with children. Wow. So I could go on for another hour on that topic.
but a beautiful introduction, and even the story with the little Froggy, the wisdom of that little one that she just reminded you of in her presence, or alerted you to, right? How beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, did you want to say something else on that?
Well, I just wanted to say that my interest in the field kind of expanded as time went by, because I was really focused at first on the children like Susie and Nathan and the idea of death and their awareness. But one of the biggest lessons I learned had to do with adults and how they relate to children. Because back then, I mean, I graduated from nursing school like in the last century, a long time ago. And back then, talking about death was just not something that people did. Doctors wouldn't talk to their patients about their terminal conditions. Parents wouldn't talk to their children. They wouldn't often talk to each other. So I love to tell this Scotty story because it showed the lack of willingness of parents to talk about their child, and again about the children's wisdom. So Scotty was a little boy about 8, and he also had leukemia. And back then, when children had their chemotherapy, they were in the hospital for a long time. So I was Scotty's primary nurse, and I cared for him for many weeks. Well, one day, or just around this time of year, Thanksgiving, Scotty was going to go home for Thanksgiving, and he lived way outside of the city, so he couldn't do this very often. His grandparents came to pick him up. Prior to this, though, his parents had been adamant that no one talked to Scotty about his prognosis. It was a clear message. So his grandparents have picked him up. They're on the elevator waiting to exit the hospital. And I see the elevator doors closing. So I ran down the hall to catch the elevator, and I squeezed in as the doors closed behind me. And there in front of me was Scotty and his grandparents. And I said to Scotty, "So, Scotty, you're going to go home for Thanksgiving?" "I am." "Be careful you don't eat too much turkey." And he looks up and he says, "Why not? I won't be here for the Christmas turkey."
Wow.
It was just, it still brings back so much emotion. So his poor grandmother, I thought she was going to fall over in the elevator. She was just aghast. They didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. And off they went. When Scotty came back after Thanksgiving, his parents brought him back, asked for a team meeting with the physician and the head nurse. And the head nurse invited me because I was looking after Scotty. And they made it very clear that they did not want anyone to talk to Scotty about his prognosis. And clearly someone had, because of what Scotty had said on the elevator. So we tried our best to do that. Again, back then, nobody knew how to handle these kinds of situations that actually happen quite often, but nobody talked about it. Nobody knew. So we continue on, and I'm looking after Scotty. And he's not doing too well. He brought back with him from Thanksgiving a pet snake. Super salami, he called him, like stuffed animal. Scotty now, because of potential infection, had to be isolated. So he was in a room, but he asked if the second bed in the room could stay. So Super Salami could have his own bed. So everything that's happened to Scotty happened all for the Super Salami. So, if you'd forget, he'd remind you that Super Salami needs breakfast too. Or the lab tech would come in to take blood from him and from Scotty, and he'd hold out his arm, and then he'd say, "Don't forget Super Salami." Super Salami was very important. So Scotty's condition was deteriorating. And one morning, I'm again looking after him, giving him a bath. And he says, "What do you think's going to happen to Super Salami?" Oh, so I had no idea what to do. I picked up Super Salami and I started to stroke him. And I said, "Scotty, I'm not absolutely sure what's going to happen to Super Salami, but I think there's going to be someone there to look after him and love him and care for him." And Scotty looks at me and he says, he said, "What I thought." He knew more than the rest of us did, So experiences like that contributed to my desire and my goal to look after children who were dying, to look after their parents, because parents play a critical role in the lives of children, and in my future students. And, when I started all of this, Belmont hadn't yet even identified the word palliative care, because he did that in 1972, and I graduated from nursing school in 1970. So it just all came together, and meeting more patients and talking to more families, and then getting more education. And my postdoc, my PhD and my postdoc was on bereaved siblings after the death of a child from cancer. So it kind of just mushroomed over the years. And the more I did, the more committed I became to doing more, because it just felt like such an important thing to do.
Well, and amazing. We're going to talk about this more, but the inherent wisdom of children and the absolute beauty of how that wisdom flowed through little stuffed toys, from their heart to yours. I mean, that in itself has a kind of a rich and magical and yet beautiful quality in the midst of a challenging time, right? So then we lead into Canuck Place. We're in the Vancouver area. I was working full-time at an adult hospice when it opened, and I had the privilege of being a volunteer there in the first year. It's a gorgeous old mansion. And it was the first freestanding hospice in North America. And you were one of the co-founders. So can you tell us a little bit about how did that vision came about and the opening of Canuck Place?
Yeah. Well, I did my PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle. And my friend and colleague, Brenda Eng, did her master's degree at the same place.
Okay.
We weren't there at quite the same time. There was only a year or two between us there, but we didn't know each other then. But my advisor was Dr. Sandra Ayers, and that was Brenda's advisor in her for her master's thesis.
Oh, just the serendipity. This is interesting.
So Sandy, of course, knew that I lived in Edmonton, but she also knew that I was moving to Vancouver. So we kept in touch. And after I got settled in Vancouver at UBC, where I was teaching, Sandy called one day and she said, I have a student here whose name is Brenda Eng. She's actually from Vancouver and is going to be returning there and has similar interests to yours. I think the two of you should meet one another. So Brenda came back to Vancouver and I was here and we finally got together. This was, I don't remember exactly, maybe 87, something like that. Yeah, it must have been 87 because that's when I moved to Vancouver. So Brenda and I met and it was like, oh my gosh, someone who has the same interests as I do. And Brenda thought the same thing. Brenda was a pediatric nurse. She'd worked on peds oncology. She had lots of clinical experience. And she was interested in helping children and their families with the whole process of dying. And I was interested in that. And I also had my interest in bereavement in children because my dissertation had been focused on sibling bereavement. So with those backgrounds, we came together. And Brenda had been in touch with Sister Frances Dominica, who established the first children's hospice in Oxford in 1982. And so she was just getting to know Sister Frances and wanted to create a hospice like, what's it called? Helen House, like Helen House in Vancouver. And we decided we could do that together. So we did. So that's how we started, just through being introduced to one another, having the same interests, and deciding we wanted to work on this project together. And so we created a steering committee that was comprised of some parents, one of the pediatric oncologists, a physical therapist, a play therapist, a social worker, and a chaplain, I think. Anyway, we had this group, I think it was 8 to 10 people, so it was relatively small. And we came together. Brenda lived at home with her parents, and they had a house close to the university, close to the hospital. And so we would meet there regularly. You know, I think it was every month at first, or every week. And it came down to every week. And we met to further develop this idea and come up with how we could do it. We had all kinds of plans. It was wonderful. And then we realized that we actually needed money to do this. We were so naive. Anyway, we decided that we needed help because our committee of nurses, pediatric oncologists, you know, we are not in professions that make a ton of money. So we are not wealthy people. So we thought we have to have someone help us find people who can contribute to this. So we decided we'll find a PR person. So we contacted 3 PR agencies. A representative from each one came at a different time to meet with our group. And each of them had the bottom line of, in order to make money, you have to spend money. But they didn't get the message that we didn't have money to spend. You know? But out of that process of meeting these other people, a man called George Jarvis, who had his own PR agency, was at a time in his life where he decided he really wanted to change direction. He wanted to get out of the regular line of work and do something really meaningful for him, he felt. Well, he heard about our project. He came, he took it on in a minute, and he knew people like the owner of the Canucks at the time, Canuck hockey team. And because of George, all these contacts were made, the money started to flow in, and it became a reality.
So I remember being there, and some of the hockey players would come and just play with the kids, and they were amazing. And it was so special for the children. It was beautiful. That's a beautiful alignment, actually. So and was there also an influence or from the Dougie Center, because the Dougie Center is a big children's bereavement center in Oregon, right?
And so as we developed the plan, my role was to develop the hospice care program. So I was chair of that committee. Brenda and I developed all kinds of committees. I think I had about 18 of them or something. And she and I were on each of them. We finally decided that wasn't going to work. So we divided them in half. And then as time went on, other people took over and stuff. So, but one of my roles was the development of the hospice care program, which included a bereavement program. So I was searching to develop, to find information about all bereavement programs I could. And back then, the Dougie Center was the only one I could find in North America.
Wow.
And there weren't any in Australia. And it was amazing. And now there are hundreds of bereavement programs for children. So again, the growth has been phenomenal and wonderful. So I went to the Dougie Center, went through their program, knew the woman who had first developed the Dougie Center, Beverly, can't remember her last name. Anyway, wonderful woman who started the Dougie Center. And now Donna Sherman took over, and now Donna has a different role. And again, the program has expanded in many, many ways. So we incorporated learning from the Dougie Center into our program plan, and that as the basis for the bereavement program, or the bereavement part of the program.
Okay, so for the audience then, pediatric palliative is a little bit of a different entity than the adult world. And so can you talk about the age range that you support and sort of the range of illnesses? Because I even remember I was in an adult hospice working full-time at the time, and I stepped into a children's hospital. I thought, okay, this is a very different, there's parallels, but there's a very different dynamic with the little one. So age range and just range of illnesses.
The age range for the hospice is from newborn to 19. And then they are transitioned into adult care. The conditions that children have who come to Canuck Place, there is oncology. There are children with cancer, but that's a small percentage of the whole. Most of the children come with illnesses such as muscular dystrophy or metabolic disorders or genetic problems, genetic conditions about which we don't know anything yet, because there are relatively few children who have some of these conditions, and it's hard to gather enough information to develop standardized care programs or things like that. So because of the nature of the conditions, that's why they sometimes end up coming back to Canuck Place over many years, get very close to the staff, of course, over that period of time, and then transition into adult care, which becomes a very difficult process to go from several years in a pediatric hospice to an adult hospice, because the conditions are different, the focus is different. And they're not dealing with people who deal with children. They become adults and deal with adult caregivers after that.
Well, and I'm sure with the depth of, like, even just in the time I was there, the depth of relationships that are created with the staff too. And as you say, it can go over years instead of just months. That probably would be a really sensitive transition from one domain to the other, right? So let's talk about the pediatric nurse. This is hours of conversation in itself, and we're taking a lot in a shorter period of time here just to help people become aware of this support that's available. And even if they're not in our area, they can look to that in their local areas, right? But so the role of the pediatric nurse, I'm going to put pressure on you here, Betty, and say, can you give us a summary of how you see the role of the pediatric nurse in relation to the child and the family?
Well, the easiest way at the moment for me to do that is to talk about my most recent book a little bit, because can I just divert a little bit?
Absolutely.
Okay. I've done many research projects throughout what feels like the centuries. But one of them focused on fathers in pediatric palliative care, or whose child was in pediatric palliative care, because throughout pediatrics, fathers historically have been excluded, actually.
I'm so glad you're saying this. Men are missed a lot of times in general in grief. We miss them, and they're experiencing it as profoundly as all the others, right?
Exactly.
So this is a beautiful part of this. Thank you for this.
So I wanted to learn about what was it like for fathers in these situations. All sorts of stories about that. But one father talked about all of the fathers talked about their interactions with healthcare providers, their encounters with healthcare providers. But this one father put it in a way that really drove home to me how important it was for us to study these encounters. And he said, there were lots of encounters, lots of experiences, lots of interactions. He said most of them were good. And in fact, they were very good. Some of them were not so good. And then he paused and he would tell a story of a negative interaction that happened that just hurt him to the core. And then tell it in detail. And then he'd say, but there were a few that were excellent. And I said, well, what made those ones excellent in your view? He said, well, and unlike the descriptions of negative encounters, which were very detailed and always are by parents, being explicit about the details of positive interactions was really hard for people to do. And I've done some reading about positive and negative interactions and positive and negative encounters with anyone. And there's a human tendency to focus on the negative rather than the positive. And somewhere I read that it's sort of a evolutionary thing, that we have to focus on the negative in order to protect ourselves from it, to be safe and survive. So it's thought to have that kind of basis. Anyway, and he says, but there were a few that were excellent. And I said, well, can you tell me what made those few excellent? He said, well, they looked me in the eye when they talked to me. They sat down when it was for a serious conversation. They didn't treat my child like a guinea pig, implying that some had. And, he said they just treated me like a human being. Well, I was astounded because I thought, isn't that the way it's supposed to be? Like, shouldn't all healthcare providers do that? Well, it turns out no. So I decided to study those positive interactions, those healthcare professionals who do things in parents' view and in their peers' views as though their interactions are excellent or exemplary. So we studied it. We called them exemplary because people who are exemplary are often seen as a model for others. They're the best of their kind. And those are the people we studied. And what we learned was that these interactions with parents, with children, with everyone, are so critical to the well-being of the parents and the children and the nurses. And so we learned that there are many components to this kind of interaction, this exemplary interaction. And we developed a windmill, using a metaphor of a windmill to describe all of these components. And what we learned from that is that the really good palliative care nurses or nurses in whatever situation really had a shared worldview with one another. They saw that everyone in our world is the same. They are treated equally. They are human beings, regardless of where they're from, what language they speak, what color they are, what religion they believe in. That is their worldview. And consequently, they see every parent as an individual person and treat them that way.
Nice.
And the whole essence of our windmill model is that the outcome of using all of these components is that they create a milieu of mattering, we called it. It's kind of this social climate of mattering. And when we first came out with the word and started to use mattering, it sounded so funny to us, to my team and me. Well, it just didn't seem like a real word somehow. So we looked it up, and sure enough, it is a word. In fact, it's a well-known psychosocial concept, but very little has been done about it, very little. And so our study ended up being about mattering. And so nurses or other healthcare professionals who follow the components of our model end up creating this milieu of mattering, which means they treat each parent as an individual human being. They listen. They have a wide base of knowledge that they bring to the encounter. There are many, many aspects of it. But it's that ability to make parents and children feel like they matter. And they engage in a process we call attuning to the particularities of the moment. Because in that moment, they listen, pay attention to, attend to whatever the parent or the child is saying. I had a little thought there that just kind of flew by and forgot to land. Anyway. So that nurses, really good nurses, especially in pediatric palliative care, because there's something about palliative care that brings people together in a way that doesn't happen in many places. And I think it's because of the presence of death, that a child is dying. Children and parents, their parents are grieving the entire time, even before the child dies, about every loss along the way. There is this sense of being able to share openly with one another, feel free to express their thoughts and opinions, parents, both, and nurses, about what's important to them. And that creates this milieu of mattering that makes people feel like they're really being cared for. And we see that in nurses in the hospice. We see it in nurses in oncology. We see it in nurses in the NICU. And it's just a beautiful thing to witness. And parents remember those moments forever, in the same way they remember the negative encounters forever. But my goal is to try to replace many of those negative encounters with these other kind of encounters and try to make things better. The other thing that comes as part of this exemplary practice, and it's not just nurses. Our study focused on nurses, physicians, social workers, chaplains, childcare workers. Interacting in this way is not limited to any one profession. It happens across the board. So there's one nurse, for example, caring for a preemie, a tiny little baby, who really isn't quite a baby yet, even almost, was caring for this baby who was going to die. And the mother was there, and her name was Sally. So the nurse said to Sally, "Here's a little cotton ball. Why don't you use this and gently wash your baby's eyes and wash his face?" And she did. The baby died that night. And the next day or a day after, the nurse got a message relayed to her, a note from Sally, where Sally said, "I so appreciate what you did." She said, "That's the only thing I ever did for my baby."
No.
So
Yeah.
Tell stories.
No, well, there's something so intimate in bathing too.
But it was such a poignant moment, the nurse, and previously for the mom to have been able to do this.
Right.
And it's moments like those, tiny little moments, that make for these special connections with parents that enable that nurse and that parent to really communicate together and feel like they're partners in caring for their child.
Wow, it's beautiful, Betty. And that's a really tender example of the intimacy of those moments, but when properly supported, how profound and healing they can be too, right?
Yeah.
So,
and they don't always have to be quite so poignant. We had a father in the hospice whose child had been admitted the next day, or the day before. And the father was a laborer, and he had way out of town, and he had been working all day and was driving. And he got to the hospital late at night, went to bed in one of the family suites where his wife was staying. And the next morning he got up, he went down for breakfast, and what he saw was granola and yogurt. And the cook noticed that this father was looking at this with not much eager anticipation. And so she went up to him and she said, "Do you see anything here that you would like for breakfast?" "No, not really." She went and made him bacon and eggs. And so the father, he was a big, burly man. He said, "I'm big," he said, "but I cried because that made me realize I needed some attention too." So it has to do with those moments between providers and parents and patients that turn into encounters that are very special and helpful.
Well, I do remember the kitchen being kind of a hub, and chocolate chip cookies were a big favorite for everybody.
The kitchen was a central place or is a central place in Canuck Place.
Right.
Yeah, because staff and parents and guests and people all eat around the same big table. And there's something about that creates a milieu that facilitates creating these milieus of mattering.
Well, and it's not just the sharing of the food in the sense of the food itself, it's the nurturing of each other and communication, right? And the metaphor of the food too, as you're saying. Yeah. That's beautiful. So I just have a question then too, in relation to when the parents are supported that way, do you find, this is not easy on a couple in a relationship, in a marriage, in a partnership. Do you find when you engage in that level of support that they fare better in the relationship during and after the death, or have you done studies around that?
We haven't actually looked at that specifically as an evaluation or a research project. But based on other studies and my own experience is that I think one of the reasons that we often hear that husbands and wives have difficulty and eventually divorce is because they don't have, in the same way that I believe, unless we know a lot about children, we don't interact with them as well as we could. And I think that in the same way, parents who don't understand their own grief reactions and their husband or their wife's grief reactions, the more they don't understand, the greater the chance of not understanding and gradually growing apart. So I think it's very important to facilitate interactions between parents and among groups of parents about what their own experience is like and how are they dealing with all of this. So in the bereavement groups at Canuck Place, when I was still there, still participating in the bereavement groups, we had it organized so that parents would come with their children on a particular night, say Tuesday nights, and then the parents would meet by themselves with a facilitator or two, and the children would meet by themselves with other facilitators. And then at the end of the evening, they'd come together. So I think it worked miracles in many ways because parents could communicate. Fathers could talk about other fathers, mothers with other mothers, but then the whole group was together so they'd learn about each other. And then the children would have their own ways of learning and expressing themselves. So I think there are ways to facilitate bringing together people rather than having them go kind of along their separate paths.
Right. Well, and so let's lean into the whole family unit too. You talked about sibling bereavement, and I mean, I've touched on it in other interviews. I shared it with you briefly before this. I mean, my husband since died from cancer, but he had a history of a child dying of leukemia and a surviving sibling, and then his wife dying of cancer. But that was at a time when the programs that he was older, the programs you had created were not in place. And so I stepped into the aftermath. They didn't get the support as a couple. The sibling didn't get the support he needed. And I watched that dynamic unfold in a really painful way as they tried to traverse it for the rest of their lives, right? Mm-hmm. So beautiful that you're working with both partners, and the siblings, we don't want to forget them. Mm-hmm. So can you speak to the importance of including and seeing that those siblings that have this child who's not well at the center, and they're sort of engaged in it too, but dancing around this event in the family mm-hmm. dynamic as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my interest in siblings actually started when I was working in Arizona. Mm. And I was head nurse of a pediatric unit. It was St. Mary's Hospital, and it was right near the freeway. So there were many car accidents, and we would get trauma victims quite frequently. And there was a family from Mexico traveling down the highway, and they were in a bad accident. The mother was killed. The father was in intensive care. Of the 4 children, the oldest son had died. The other 3 came to our unit.
Wow. 2
of them were quite young, like a year, and then about two, and they were pretty good. I mean, in terms of injuries. And the Juan, the little 8-year-old boy, and he had a broken shoulder and a clavicle. And they didn't speak much English. Mm-hmm. So he came in early in the morning, in the middle of the night, and they were from Mexico. I'm not sure if I said that. Someone in the hospital was able to contact the family, the other members of the family in Mexico, and their family priest said he would come and be with the children and the father. So he came. We were waiting for him to come. He was a very old man, Father Gonzalez. He had obviously heard many sad stories in his life. And so he had the job of telling Juan about what had happened to his mother and his older brother. And he was filled with the best of intentions. But he went to the bedside. He stood on the opposite side of the bedside table, so he was at a distance from Juan. And Juan saw him coming and lit up because it was a familiar face. Mm-hmm. And Father Gonzalez said, "Juan, I have bad news for you. In the accident, your mother and your older brother were killed. Your father is very ill, and the 2 little ones are doing okay. But now, since it was your older brother who was killed and your father is ill, you are going to have to be the man of the family."
Oh, no.
And little Juan, who was this skinny little 8-year-old with this broken shoulder and in a sling, went from being this very meek little boy, straightening up his skinny little shoulders as well as he could, and took on the words of the priest, because that priest was pretty important to him. So what he said, he had to become the brave man of the family. Well, I never knew what happened to little Juan, but it started my interest in sibling bereavement because of how we deal with the children, like in that situation. So that's why I studied sibling bereavement specifically. And I found that siblings, you can categorize the way they respond into four ways. First of all, I hurt. These are the words that children use. I hurt. I don't understand. I don't belong. And I'm not enough. Oh. And so what we have to, keeping those in mind, when children hurt, we have to comfort them. Mm-hmm. Just simply comfort them. When they don't understand, we have to teach them and explain things. When they feel like they don't belong, it's because they find that no one else they know has had a brother or sister die. They don't feel like they fit anywhere anymore. Maybe they don't even fit in their family in any way like they did before. And the last one, which is, I think, the most important one, is I'm not enough. And my best example, well, one of many examples of this, is a family where the little girl had died. Say Susie had died. She died when she was 8. And just before that, she had drawn pictures that children do in school. So her mother, after her death, collected all those pictures that Susie had drawn, framed them, and put them on the wall beside the table where they ate all of the time, part of the kitchen. So when I went to interview this family and find out what was going on, the mom told me about this wall and how it had such meaning for her. Every time she looked at it, she had a fond memory of the day Susie brought that picture home, or the way she giggled when she drew this one. So it gave her great comfort. When I asked the dad, he said, well, he said, that's kind of my wife's project. I really don't pay much attention to it. So it didn't really have the same meaning at all for him. And for the little boy, Peter, who now himself was 8 years old, he'd been younger when his sister died. He was 8. And he said, well, I don't really like the wall. I asked Mommy if I could put my pictures up there too, and she said no, because Susie had drawn those pictures, and he could draw more pictures for Mommy, but Susie could never draw any more pictures. So you see where that little boy began to feel like, I'm not enough. I'm not enough to make my Mommy happy again. I'm not enough, and I'm certainly not as special as Susie was. And so children begin to feel, I'm not enough. Right. So I think we have to pay attention to that. And if we think of those 4 responses that they have, then we can interact with them with a different focus for each of those and make things a little bit better for the siblings, because they often are forgotten. They're not included. Lots of times, other arrangements are made for them so that they don't have to go to the funeral. But throughout all of those things we do, really, adults are trying to protect themselves because they don't want to cry in front of the child, or they don't want the child to make them cry, or, this whole business about expressing our grief and our emotions. Children don't learn to do that unless they observe it in people they care about.
Exactly. Well, and as I said, with my husband's surviving sibling, he felt unseen as it all unfolded, and the parents were trying to deal with their own grief without support. So how could they turn to a child and the vulnerability of their surviving child?
Exactly.
So again, just watching him traverse that, but it was quite painful. And so what I think is so beautiful. And when I was the program director at a different hospice, we had clinical counselors on staff and had children's support groups, and even brought them one time to Canuck Place to learn even more with what you're doing with the siblings. And what I've seen there is so beautiful, because when even the little ones, like if a little one who's 3 is dying and there's a 5-year-old sibling, I observed as the staff included them all, and the little one would be up on the bed when the other one was imminently dying, but inviting them into life, allowing them their own feelings and teaching them about life and love and death and all of that, which with the inherent wisdom of the child, like you said, with the stuffed toys, it's brilliant to see how they actually lean into it and fare very well if it's supported, right? So beautiful.
And if they're not included, they grow up and become adults, and then they don't know how to help their children.
Right.
It becomes passed on almost from generation to generation. So the earlier we can intervene in little ways, it's not a big deal. You just have to include the children in everything that's being done. And that really does make a difference for them.
Well, and we used to have babies at home and die at home. I say this a lot, and children be running in and out. I'm on the West Coast now, but my sister married a French Canadian back east, and they still have open caskets. And my niece and nephew, since they were little, have seen dead bodies because of the French Canadian culture. So it's very different experience for them because from a young age, they were exposed to it, right?
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm looking at the time. We've got a few things, but I do want to, so I'm going to just touch in on, we've covered a lot of the key points. I've got a last few questions here. There's actually a lot of joy in the children's hospice. You walk in, you're thinking it's all going to be, but there's so many activities. There's play, there's the volcano room, there's creative arts. So talk to me about activity and art and how art and creativity is woven into the programs with the children and how helpful it is in the healing.
Well, it's one of the things that's just available for the children. So even in the schoolroom, the teacher has all kinds of activities and things in the classroom where the ill children and their siblings, when they're visiting, can go to school. There's a room filled with art supplies where the children could go and paint, and a different day do finger painting or whatever. Just a lot of the expressive arts are facilitated. One of my favorite things was always the music therapist. The music therapy is wonderful, not just for the children, but also for the parents, because we often talk about including the children in the adult activities. Well, sometimes it's the other way around. We have to include the adults in the children's activity, or, in children's activities, not necessarily their child's activities. Because the music brings out feelings and thoughts, and the children will, pound on things to make a banging music noise. And other times they just want to hum quietly to themselves, But with the help of a music therapist, so much is accomplished, and it facilitates the well-being of the staff as well. The other thing that I think is really important is our rituals to deal with death when it occurs. And at Canuck Place, the ritual when a child dies is that there will be a candle lit and placed on the mantle and the fireplace in one of the big comfy living room kind of places, so that anyone who comes in to the hospice sees that candle and knows that a child has died. So the tone is lowered. It makes a really big difference. And then at the team meeting, which is held regularly once a week, everyone comes. The physicians, the nurses, the social workers, the cook, the housekeeper, everyone is entitled to come to be part of the team. And at the beginning of the week, when a child has died during the past week, we go around the circle and everyone shares a memory or a thought or some little tribute to that child, which is helpful for the parents to know that the staff has this ritual that's just for them. And it's also very helpful for the staff who work there, because encountering death day after day can be hard work, emotionally hard work. But those kinds of rituals can do a lot to help with that. It allows people to express what they're thinking and feeling, and kind of get the support from one another, give and get support, mutual support with your team members. And that's important too.
Well, you're honoring each life so profoundly, and how that life has impacted everyone, from the direct loved ones and the staff themselves, because those are intimate times with the staff, especially if it's lasted over years, right? So, yeah. I also you had a volcano room too. I want to talk about all the emotions, because there's the creative and playful side, but you also had the volcano room.
I know, that was my favorite when I was with the bereavement groups. I just loved going into the volcano room, because the children would for maybe people who don't know, a volcano room was a small room with thick padding on the walls, protection covering the lights. So it's a safe room, brightly colored like a volcano exploding, and children go in there, and any emotion that they feel, it just needs to come out, they can express it. So they punch and they pull, not each other. And there are rules about what you can do. You can't hurt another person. You can't punch them in the head, But within the context of those general safety rules, children can do whatever they want. I remember one little boy. I'll always remember him. He was about 4, and his mom had died. And he was in this room. He came in, and he was just very quiet. The first couple of weeks when we were in there once a week, he just sat at the side and kind of watched the other kids play. And one of the stuffed toys in there, lots of stuffed toys, one of them was kind of a large polar bear, a large stuffed polar bear. And there was a baby polar bear too. So this little guy finally picks up the baby polar bear. And so then he would play with him, kind of quietly, and rock him and hug him a little bit. Not much expression, really. One day he came in and he got closer to the mother bear, and he punched that mother bear every which way, in the nose, in the eyes, in the ears. And he did that for several weeks. Then next time he came, he picked up the baby bear, he took it to the mother bear, and he put them together. So what he was doing was expressing the anger at his mother for having left him, which is a perfectly normal and natural response.
Right.
And he worked out that frustration and that anger, and then got the little baby and returned it to mom, and they were together again. It was
No.
I mean, you couldn't make up a story
No.
any better than watching that take place over several weeks. The volcano room is just, I think, I always said there should be a volcano room for the parents and the staff.
Well, and the power of the stuffed animals too. They're like some of the biggest, companions in the place is the stuffed animals and all they represent and how voices go through them. Right? It's quite touching.
At the Dougie Center, the first time I went there, I loved this. They had a teddy bear on every chair in their meeting room. Oh. So when people of the board members came, or any dignitaries or whatever, in order to sit down, they had to pick up a bear.
No.
And I thought it was wonderful. So after that, in my own home, in my living room or family room, we have teddy bears. Because it's just, we get older and we grow up. And we're not supposed to like teddy bears anymore. We're not supposed to play like children, which is all such a shame because we all really are children inside. So we have teddy bears around, and fortunately my husband likes them too. So we have a bunny and we have a couple of bears and we have a big whale. So when people come, you can sit down and you can just hold the bear,
Yeah.
And it just creates an atmosphere of being able to express things or be cared about, or all things that are lower than our head level, It's no wonder we all get headaches because our heads are so busy all the time. We just have to give them a rest for a while and cuddle a bear.
Yeah, I thank you for that, because I'm in the teddy bear camp. I love teddy bears, so I've got them around my place too. So because I'm very tactile too, so a teddy bear is like just the little fluffiness of them. It's beautiful, right? So
yeah.
Okay, I have 2 last questions. We've heard more and more about deathbed visions and dreams. Dr. Christopher Kerr out of Buffalo Hospice in New York is doing more research on that. And notorious, I saw Elizabeth Kubler-Ross speak years ago in the 90s, and she talked about how open children are, like it's unfiltered, the wisdom of children. So I just want to ask you, I've heard people say that children are more open organically that way, just because of they haven't been conditioned not to share, which may or may not be true. At end of life, there's a sensitivity, it seems, to that. So can you speak to what you've witnessed about the spirit? Maybe we'd say existential, because the word spiritual doesn't resonate with everybody, but some of the unique, have you witnessed children sharing unique visions or dreams as they near death?
Well, I have a story about two little boys. When I was a pediatric clinical teacher, and the pattern on the floor was when a child was really ill, they would be moved closer to the station, to the nurse's station. And there was a room with a window so that, it wasn't a closed off room. You could always see the child and know if he was in trouble or needed help or whatever. So there were these two little boys admitted, both had cancer. Both lived far away out of town. Henry was about 4 or 5, and Mark was about 3, maybe coming 4. They both were admitted about the same time, and they became fast friends. Every weekend, Henry's parents would come and take him to the farm where they lived. Little Mark was a First Nations child, and his parents lived so far away, they couldn't come and get him every weekend. So every Saturday morning after Henry's parents had come and taken him back to the farm, little Mark would get up, go directly to Henry's room, and he'd say, "Henry gone home," because neither of them spoke English very well. But together they learned all kinds of words, like IV, the medical terms they could share. So little Mark comes and says, "Henry gone home." And then he would be content and he would play. Monday morning, he'd get up, run down the room, minute back. This went on for quite a while. Henry got sicker and sicker. And one night he died. The next morning, little Mark comes down to visit Henry, and he pulls a chair over so he can stand up and look in this window, as he often did. And he looked in, and there was nothing in the room. The bed had been cleared and cleaned, and Henry was gone. And he stood back, he got down off the chair, and he looked over at us at the nursing station, and he says, "Henry not gone home. Henry gone home."
No.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
We didn't know what to say, but that little boy, as young as he was, had a sense of knowing where his friend had gone, and it was not to the home at his farm for the weekend. So again, I learned from children that they have a sense of wisdom, perhaps of spirituality, that I think they lose, not because they want to lose it, but because the world kind of imposes things on little children. And then they grow up and forget about that kind of innate spirituality or innate sensitivity, whatever it is, and however they choose to express it. So I do believe that children have an understanding and a wisdom and perhaps even a spirituality that is basic, but it's there. And if given an opportunity to express it, they will.
Beautiful. Okay, my last signature. There's a lot in touching in on our hearts.
All right. I could talk all day, as you can tell. So
yeah, but I mean, it's so heartfelt too, and just even your grief surfacing with tears, and just to me shows the passion and the commitment and the depth of your humanity and how your work has touched you and transformed you too.
Well, let me tell you just a short story about. When I lived in Arizona and was the head nurse of this pediatric unit, myself, a chaplain, and a physician, John, I'm forgetting names today. Anyway, 3 of us were all interested in death and dying. And we decided we would form a committee. We called it the Quality for Life Committee, not of life, but for life committee. We met regularly. We had groups of people or individuals come and talk to us, and we'd open it up to the staff in the hospital or parents or all kinds of family members. We had a Jewish person come and talk about the Jewish faith, and a Navajo person come and talk about Navajo practices. It was very good. And we would talk to parents, adults, children, anyone who was interested in death. We would talk. Anyway, another story is how I first met Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but by this time I knew her. And she loved coming to Phoenix. And so she had some contract in Phoenix that she came to regularly. And she volunteered to be our consultant. So every about 6 weeks, we would go to Phoenix from Tucson to meet with her. Mm-hmm. And several times I would be talking to a parent or a family member, and they would tell me things, and I couldn't help but cry, because they were just so meaningful and tender. And one time I was sitting with a young adult woman who was very ill. She was going to die, and she was concerned about her 2 children. And it was just more comfortable for me to sit on her bed, so we were at the same level. And I was sitting there on the bed, and we were holding hands and crying together. When the supervisor came by and knocked sort of on the door and just barged in, saw this upstart, as she called me, upstart of a head nurse talking to this girl, and they're both crying. And not only that, she's sitting on the bed. Well, okay. So I got called into the director of nursing, who was much more understanding than the supervisor. But it really distressed me that, I had done something wrong. So went to Phoenix to meet with Elizabeth. And she said, she hated mornings. She hated getting up in the morning. But the only time we could meet was like 6:30 or something one morning. So we're sitting out by the pool. The sun is coming up. Beautiful morning. She's having her usual cigarette. And she said, so I said, Elizabeth, I've got something really important to talk to you about today. She said, okay, what is it? So I told her what I just told you about crying on the bed and whatever. And she looked at me and she said, what? And so I started to repeat it. And she said, no, I heard you the first time. I just don't understand you. She says it in her lovely Swiss accent. And I said, well, Elizabeth, I cry. I remember she stood up, like all foot, 5 feet nothing of her. And she said, you wake me up this time of day to tell me you cry? Thank God you do. And she walked off. So there was a time when I would tell a story and I would do everything I could to not cry. But now I just let the tears come, and that's how it is.
it's your humanity, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, how beautiful. So on that note, the last signature question is, how has your heart been changed, or has it been changed by this work?
Oh, boy. I guess I don't know that I would use the word changed. I would probably say it's been more of a development. Mm-hmm. Like over time, I feel like I'm not afraid of dying myself. In fact, I just said to my husband the other day, if I were to die now, I would feel like I had lived a good life. Mm-hmm. I don't want to die now, but I could if I had to. So I think I've become more philosophical maybe about death. And I think also recognizing that death is a part of life, that it's part of the cycle. And if we resist that or try to avoid that, I think it makes for a lot of deep unhappiness. Mm-hmm. So I think it brings a kind of inner wisdom maybe, or inner peace about life and death. And it also makes me appreciate life so much. Mm-hmm. There's so much to be grateful for. And so I think it's expanded the gratitude I have for my life and for many things. So, and my work has been very meaningful. I mean, I'm just now retiring for the 3rd time because it's taken me this long to kind of practice not doing it anymore or being retired. But I'm learning now. I have something new to learn, so it's good. There's also, I have my office is surrounded by photographs of children with special meanings underneath them, and this is one of my favorite. It says, every adult needs a child to teach. it's the way that adults learn. And so I think I have learned so much from children, young children, adolescents too, but young children are like, I don't know what, like a new flower as it gradually opens up, and it hasn't been touched so much by the winds and the rains and the sleet and the snow of the climate that surrounds us in terms of the other people around us, I mean. So I think it's given me peace, some inner wisdom, satisfaction, gratitude. Yeah, it's been meaningful, very meaningful as a career. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I want to remind people of the book that you've just released this year too, pulling on all of that wisdom. It's titled, again, Pediatric Palliative Care, a Model of Exemplary Practice, because you're trying to focus on the positive and the exquisite examples of nursing care. My understanding is it's sort of geared to professionals, but the public and families could learn from the book as well, right? So
definitely. One of the women on I always have a parent advisory committee on my work, my research. And one of the women on that committee said, this really helps me as a parent and other parents to give feedback to healthcare providers about what they do well and some guidance as to what they might do better. So, I'm gratified that parents find it useful too. I gave a presentation on it in Australia a couple of years ago, and presenting a lot. You know what it's like when you see a person in the front row sitting with their arms crossed, their legs extended, and kind of frowning. And so I was kind of worried about this woman. And of course, when I asked at the end, I'm happy to receive any comments or questions, her hand shot up before anyone else's. And I just thought inside, oh, no, what's she going to say? And she said, I've been thinking as I listened to you, and I've listened very carefully. And I think what you've told us about today is really applicable to life itself.
That's nice.
I nearly burst into tears because I was so relieved that she had something positive to say rather than what I thought she might say. But I think it's true because all of us interact with other people all the time.
Exactly.
And we're not sometimes aware of what we can do to make those interactions even better than they might be. And lots of times in the presentations, there are people who sort of think, oh, I do that. Yeah, I do that. Well, the more I have come to discover, the more a person thinks they are an exemplary practitioner, the less likely they are. Because one of the aspects of exemplary practice is being self-aware. Well,
that's beautiful. Well, I thank you for taking the time to come and share your wisdom with us, and so many publications, this beautiful book that's come out, but I just want to honor. I just touched in on pediatric briefly and then saw the counselors in the adult hospice support the children, but magnificent, groundbreaking work. Canuck Place is a beautiful place for children and families, and I honor, as a pioneer, your work in the field because it's a gift to so many people. So thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us today.
Thank you, Barbara. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.